Good morning and welcome to Ask SCSA on Thursday. So today we're going to get started. My name is Joanne Davis. I'm a safety advisor at the Regina office. And I just want to recap a little bit before we get started. On Tuesday, we had our first executive panel and the presentation was on asbestos. And that presentation is available for viewing if you missed it. And I'm just going to go ahead and post that link in the chat box for everyone. It was a great presentation and I urge you to take a look at that. Okay, just give me 2 more seconds here. Okay, so today we have Kelly, Curtis, and Mike, and we do have an auditor as well who will be joining us. So let's go ahead and do our introductions. Kelly, if you can start.
Hey, my name is Kelly Champagne. I am the Program Services Manager with the SCSA, and I look after the CORE and C-CORE and NCSO and HSA programs.
Thank you, Kelly. Curtis?
Hi, I'm Curtis Prod, Safety Advisor out of the Saskatchewan office.
Mike, go ahead.
Thanks, Joanne. I'm glad to be here today. My name is Mike Moore. I'm a Safety Advisor out of the Saskatchewan office as well.
Thank you. I was saying when our auditor joins us, we'll give him a chance to introduce himself as well. So let's go over some housekeeping. This webinar is on Zoom and is being recorded. You can also view it on Facebook Live. And it can be available for viewing after on Facebook as well as on YouTube. So we do ask if you have questions that you post them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. And you can also ask questions on Facebook. Someone is watching that and will relay it to us. So today we are going to start with a presentation on Prime Contractor, and Curtis will be doing that for us.
Absolutely, thanks, Joanne. Yes, as Joanne said, I will be doing a presentation on Prime Contractor. So just give me a minute here and I will get the screen set up. So as Joanne stated, yes, this is a presentation on Prime Contractor. So in January 2015, Prime Contractor regulations were put into effect in Saskatchewan. With Prime Contractor, the responsibility overview is the coordination of safety is essential when with multiple trades on site. The Prime Contractor gets all parties involved on the same page and ensures that the hazards on the site and the hazards associated to the activities of the site are being dealt with and coordinated between all parties. The owner has the overall responsibility of health and safety on the work site, and the Prime Contractor allows the project owner the opportunity to transfer most of their health and safety responsibilities to that third party. So the regulations in regard to Prime Contractor is to ensure that every work site has a party that will take an overall role in health and safety. So if we look at a story out of Manitoba, okay, so in April 2011, there was a fatality at a generator plant near Thompson, Manitoba. In 2014, the project owner was fined over $180,000 for the avoidable death of a 66-year-old man that was actually set to retire in just 13 days. It was a short-term job of dismantling a large Quonset used to produce cement. The worker was killed instantly when he was struck by a large metal rod. According to the reports by Manitoba's Crown Attorney, stated that a loader was dismantling a large tent panel when the fabric ripped and a 10-foot metal rod was sent hurling towards the worker, striking him in the head. The project owner failed to ensure that the hazards were identified, communicated, and controlled. In addition, they failed to ensure that there was a safe work procedure for the dismantling of the Quonset. The fine was the largest kind imposed in Manitoba and related directly to Prime Contractor duties. On a project, both the owner and the contractor have responsibilities. The owner has the duty to ensure that their workplace complies with legislation, the site is maintained, and that it does not endanger the health and safety of anybody. Besides the owner, the contractor is responsible for safety as well. They have the highest level of responsibility to ensure that the work site and all the work that happens is done safely. This is fairly straightforward. Contractors set the minimum standard for the site, everyone follows the law, but we must never fall below the site minimum standards or the regulatorily minimum standards as well. In Saskatchewan, the Employment Act talks about general duties of a prime contractor. Like I stated earlier, on January 1st, 2015, prime contractor regulations were added to the back of the Saskatchewan Employment Acts and Regulations, becoming effective in law. The prime contractor regulations did get their own blue pages as well. These regulations lay out specifically when a prime contractor is needed and the authority of the prime. It also details the expectations of owners, employers, self-employed persons, prime contractors, and the specific activities that each workplace group shall perform. Due to the hazardous nature of three industries in Saskatchewan, prime contractor applies strictly to the oil and gas industry, the forestry industry, and finally the construction industry. This does include all multi-employer industrial, commercial, and residential projects with one exception. Construction industry does not include activities or operations undertaken by a person in connection with construction or renovation if the worksite has dwellings that are less than 4 units. It is important to realize the definition of construction means the erection, altercation, renovation, repair, dismantle, demolition, structural maintenance, and painting of a structure. And this also includes land clearing, earth moving, grading, excavating, trenching, digging, boring, drilling, blasting, and concreting, and the installation of any plant. In the construction industry, there will be some multi-employer work sites that do not require a prime contractor. For example, a single home construction or renovation regardless on number of contractors. So as you can see in these pictures, that is a single home dwelling meant for one family. Here's a large multi-employer single unit dwelling. This is TV celebrity Drake's house under construction, large in size and scope than many commercial developments. And on this site today, we have 1 general, 5 contractors, and 30 workers. In this situation, prime is not required as this is a residential construction work site as a single dwelling. Keep in mind that the acts and regulations are a minimum standard and a job of this size would greatly benefit from the use of a prime contractor. But like I stated, the owner and contractor in this situation still have the requirements for safety on this site. Here we have a residential development. There are 8 separate lots with single detached homes on each side. Built by 1 general contractor, all the homes are being built at the same time and are at different levels of completion. The general contractor also has a job trailer across the street. At any given time on this site, there is 1 general contractor, 5 subtrades, and 30 workers. In this situation, there is no prime needed as each work site consists of a single unit dwelling. However, the Saskatchewan Employment Act does still put an onus on the contractor to provide a safe work site. In this scenario, we have a residential development that is 1 unit with 4 dwellings. Each dwelling is a different level of completion. This is a fourplex that is individually titled lots with fences and distinct property lines of separating ownership. The only difference between this work site and the last one we just went over is the aspect of shared walls. Again, here we have 1 general, 5 subtrades, and 30 workers. Because of the unit, this unit is a 4 dwellings and is 1 work site. Due to the shared walls and roofs, a prime contractor would be needed. Prime contractor regulations state that the only exclusion is a unit that has 3 or less dwellings. This unit does have 4 dwellings. This is the most interesting scenarios of all residential, is the residential gated community. Okay, so here we have a multiplex and triplex homes built in 1 location. All these homes share a main address with separate addresses inside the gated community. Here we have 1 owner that hired 1 general contractor with 5 subtrades and 30 workers on site. So if you've been following along, all the scenarios have had 1 general, 5 subtrades, and 30 workers. So here there's 13 buildings. 12 of them are being residential duplexes, and across the street is one small commercial space building. Is Prime required? No, because none of the work sites, none of the 12 work sites have over 3 dwellings. This would be different, of course, if any of these duplexes had basement suites. Then that would make them essentially a 4-plex. In this example, there's no basement suites. Here, there's a lot going on sites like the shared roadways and shared access gates and routes. This would all come into play if this was tested in courts. So let's say we decide no Prime is needed, and as an owner, I'm not assigning a Prime for this project. What about the construction of the small commercial building? Here, if there were 2 employers and 10 or more workers engaged on that work site, then yes, it would fit the requirements of that specific building. Here we have a commercial example. So here there is one owner having a shopping mall built, and he hires 3 surveyors. At this point, Prime Contractor does not apply. But if the owner hires a general contractor to oversee the project and the general contractor arrives when the surveyors are still on site, Prime Contractor regulations would apply, making the owner automatically the Prime Contractor. Now that we've reviewed which projects need a Prime and which do not, the project owner is the one to decide who they will proceed with the project and who will be managing certain aspects. Now let's look at the owner's duties. The owner is going to appoint a Prime Contractor, complete this with a written agreement contract, and comply with the Prime Contractor's directions. Once the owner chooses a Prime Contractor, they are legally responsible to that Prime moving forward. It is important that as an owner, we consider a few aspects when choosing the right Prime Contractor. So first, we're going to look at knowledge. Do they understand applicable regulations? Are they experienced as a Prime? So you might want to do a background check, refer to references, things like that. Do they have the experience to identify the best equipment, people for the project, and understanding the physical environment of the workplace? And training. What training have they received to do their job competently? The capacity. Do they have the time? Their HR resources. Are they capable of hiring, firing, dealing with orientations, things like that? Subcontractors. Do they know how to deal with and delegate work to other subcontractors? The contractor must have time and resources to accomplish their requirements. This is an important one to think about before the agreement is contracted and signed. The contractor must be able to find a balance between meeting their Prime Contractor responsibilities and the other parts of their businesses like quality and production. The owner would need to confirm that the Prime has a plan in place to manage functions and competent people to manage safety. And then we look at control. Prime must have the cooperation and support of the other employers on site. This includes resolving any safety infractions that occur, have the authority to enforce safety rules and procedures, and be able to engage the owner to solve problems if necessary. If one of these 3 key elements is missing, the contractor may not be able to act as Prime Contractor. The 2 groups should work together to find a solution on how the contractor can get the knowledge, capacity, and control to successfully do the job. If a solution is not found, the responsibility of coordinating the safety activities would go back on the owner. So now the project owner has decided to delegate a Prime Contractor to their upcoming project. This needs to be more than a mere handshake or verbal agreement. Legislation states that this must be a written contract, something the owner should consider. Does the contract lay out specific expectations and responsibilities of the Prime? This is a critical document to make sure that the owner has all information when hiring the competent Prime Contractor. This visual explains the flow of responsibilities ranked from top and of the highest degree of control. Keep in mind, this is just an example and may not fit some scenarios. As a safety coordinator position, they also have a significant role in the health and safety on a work site. A qualified safety coordinator hired by the Prime Contractor coordinates health and safety of the entire workplace and also oversees activities ensuring everyone is following proper health and safety protocol on the site. The prime contractor must do their due diligence to ensure the safety coordinator is competent for that position. The role of a safety coordinator informs contractors, subcontractors, and workers of known hazards on the site. They ensure all hazards are addressed throughout the duration of the work activities. So in summary, looking at this chart, the owner owns the property, plant, and equipment used for the site. The prime contractor also signs an agreement, but the agreement is much more detailed with more duties assigned. They coordinate the safety of the worksite, ensuring compliance with health and safety legislation. Then the safety would coordinate all aspects of safety from there, moving the chain of command down to the contractors, and then the contractors will delegate to their subcontractors. Once the contract is signed, the owner is not completely off the hook and may not want to be for two reasons. One, the cost, delays, and safety mishaps are definitely concerns of the owner moving forward. No matter how you look at this is the owner's worksite, and it demands that the owner stays engaged. They may be called upon to advise on matters that can only be answered by the owner. Two, no matter how tight the contract details are, in delegating the responsibilities of safety of prime contractor, the owner will always have continued responsibility to ensure that the prime is fulfilling their contract. The owner may want to periodically evaluate and monitor the prime contractor's performance through reviewing of documentation. We have already discussed the importance of having knowledge, capacity, and control necessary to do the work. A few very important things that will assess the prime in doing their day-to-day operations on site. Healthy communication is going to be the most important aspect of a productive job site. The prime contractor is required to post their names and contact information on site so they can be easily contacted when needed. Know who the designated supervisors are for each company working on site so that any safety-related communication can be done through the prime contractor and the employer's supervisors. Supervisors ensure their workforce is informed. It is extremely important to not forget about the short-term workers, like your suppliers or specialty trades. If there are any self-employed people working on site, like your truck drivers or equipment operators, they also need to be engaged in prime. Along with the contact between supervisors, establishing a joint OHC may be an effective way of communicating on a larger worksite with multiple employers. No matter how it is accomplished, it will be important that open lines of communication exist in the duration of the project. The regulations state that the prime must post their name and a method to contact them in a highly visible location at the entrance of the site, as well as the individual that is overseeing the activities of the employers, workers, and subcontractors. The prime contractor must also ensure that all activities are conducted in a safe and healthy manner, and that all employers and subcontractors have the appropriate policies, procedures, practices, equipment, competent workers, and information in place before the workforce begins working on site. They also need to make sure that all employers have adequate and appropriate policies, procedures, and safe work practice equipment, competent personnel, and any other information to ensure that they're equipped to work safely. The prime contractor must prepare a project-specific safety plan that establishes how they will fulfill their role. This written plan will be shared with all parties involved on the worksite. It sets up the project for success, successfully managing all matters in relation to health and safety, and must contain adequate details to accomplish this. Once the project is underway, prime contractor is responsible for the ongoing identification and control of hazards, but also for investigating any safety concerns brought to their attention. As the prime contractor, you have the authority and are required to make the necessary decisions regarding the coordination of activities that affect safety. For difficult decisions, it may be necessary to consult with the employers and workers on site to get their information. Now that we've spoken about owner and prime contractor, the other piece of the puzzle is the workforce. As a contractor or employer working on a site, where with a prime contractor, it is important that we understand some things. We recognize the authority from the prime contractor. We provide owner or prime contractor with all requested information, comply with prime contractor directions, communicate your work activities, and provide contact information of a competent site supervisor. The prime contractor is legally obligated to make sure that you work safe and that your work activities do not cause potential harm to others on the site. Here are a few things to keep in mind. The prime contractor has been tasked to coordinate safety on site. As long as the prime directions is reasonable, then the employer must comply. The prime is going to need you to provide information about your staff and work activities. This will be done prior to work beginning and during the project as needed. Open lines of communication are going to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Each employer or self-employed person will provide of a contact supervisor and contact information to the prime. The employer's assigned supervisor will be the person that is engaged when any safety-related communication is needed. Everyone on site must work together to ensure that the site can be coordinated safely and that hazards are dealt with. This person needs to be available for the prime when needed. This establishes the supervisor as the main contact for information. The prime communicates to the supervisor to reach the crews. When an employer's crew member on site has a safety-related issue, they will communicate this to their supervisor, and then the supervisor will then take their concerns to the prime contractor to be rectified. This makes the prime contractor's ability to engage all parties on site achievable. It is going to be the employer's responsibility to provide a competent supervisor. In establishing their competency, the employer will ensure that the supervisors know how to fulfill their role on site. They will be required to understand and enforce legislation and site-specific requirements. So in summary, when is it necessary to have a prime contractor? In the oil and gas industry, in the forestry industry, and finally in the construction industry. 2 or more employers or subcontractors engaged with 10 or more workers or self-employed people on site. And like I said, any dwelling units of 4 or more. Owners are automatically designated prime when necessary, or they can assign prime contractor responsibilities to another party through a contract. Prime contractor responsibilities, they need to establish a plan, keep open lines of communication, mitigate hazards, and then the owner is going to relieve the prime in writing when duties are finished. Our ability to provide due diligence and ensure that our project-specific safety plan is being executed may come down to the collection of documentation. It is going to be very helpful to use consistent forms and system to help stay organized. Share the documentation with those on the worksite, ensuring not to forget the smaller subcontractors. The prime will need to establish a system to show that they are managing their roles effectively. As part of the owner system to monitor and evaluate the subcontractor, they may require to see documentation. This documentation must be available to any authority. Again, thank you to Joanne and Mike for helping me put this presentation together, as well as the whole advisory team for their input. Thanks, guys. There.
Thank you, Curtis, for that presentation. There's a lot of great information in there, and we do have a few questions regarding it coming up. Before we get to our questions, I just want to give a chance to Kerry, who has now joined us, to introduce himself.
Good morning. Sorry for the delayed login. My name is Kerry Greening. I'm from the Saskatoon office and a program auditor.
Thank you for joining us, Kerry. And I also want to give this opportunity for Kelly, if there is an update from program services.
It's not anything outstanding and new this week. We are continuing to book C-Corps audits, and we're performing C-Corps audits remotely through Teams right now. We are also going to be embarking upon core audits as well, doing those remotely as well. I would encourage anyone who has a core audit that's coming due, if you've got your reminder package, please contact our office. Our spots are filling up very, very quickly, and we want to ensure that we can get you guys slotted in a spot that's going to work for you. System is a little bit different now, having to use Microsoft Teams and an FTP site for your documentation, but we've got a great group of people, including Carrie, who's with us today, that are there to help walk you through the process and make it fairly painless.
Thank you again, Kelly. Yeah, we do have a few companies that are going through their C-Corps or core audit that are coming up. And again, I do believe that a lot of the advisors assigned to those companies will be contacting them to assist them organize documentation as well. So that's really important. Before uploading, maybe contact your advisor. I'm sure we've been in contact with most of them. So now let's get to a couple questions. Before we do that, again, I want to say we just did a presentation on Prime Contractor. That is also one of the classes here at the SCSA. It goes a little bit more in depth, more group activity and conversation around it. So this was just an introduction, kind of giving an overview of what Prime Contractor is. So let's take a look at a couple of questions here. One has to do with training on site. Can I have my contractor sign off saying that they have all the required training? Do I actually need proof? Yeah, what advice can we give this contractor? Go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah, can you just repeat that question again? Sorry, Joanne.
Okay. So this is an employer who has contractors on site and want to know if they can just sign off saying that they have the appropriate training, or do they actually need to see the proof of training?
Yes, you need
certificates and everything.
Absolutely. You're going to want to have all your employers and employees provide their appropriate documentation for training. Absolutely. Yeah. Mike, did you want to elaborate on that a little bit? It
Yeah,
like you want to.
Yeah, sure, Curtis. Thanks. There's a couple places in legislation that it discusses training. If we're talking in regards to Prime Contractor directly, I'll read this out. Prescribed activities for Prime Contractor. This is in the Prime Contractor Regulation, number 5, actually. So for the purposes of Section 313 of the Act, Prime Contractor shall, and this is 5C, ensure insofar as reasonably practicable that all employers and self-employed persons have adequate and appropriate policies, procedures, safe work practices, equipment, competent workers, and information to ensure that they can do their job safely. A little more detail there. But when it talks about competent workers, like the only way you can get a competent worker, say in a piece of equipment, working at heights, things like that, one of those pieces is training. So they can have all the experience in the world, but if they haven't been trained, there's potentially pieces that they're missing, bad practices that they've developed over time, shortcuts, things like that. So any work that they're required to do, you would want to verify, especially in high-risk applications like driving equipment, stuff like that, that they do have the training in place.
Thank you, Curtis and Mike. Again, for your own due diligence as an employer, you want to verify the training, not just have them sign off. That's not going to provide your due diligence. So again, you do need to verify. Okay. So the next question, I think we already answered. As a general contractor, is it my responsibility to make sure contractors I hire are trained in aerial lift? So again, we just answered that one. If they don't come on trained, it's going to be a responsibility to make sure they get trained.
Yeah, and I'll actually join in on that one a little bit to elaborate. They, when it comes to responsibilities for training of workers and that, obviously an employer, like the direct employer of an employee, has a great responsibility. It's a huge responsibility to ensure they're providing training to workers in all our respects to the work performed. And that's stated clearly in legislation that training to workers is an extremely important piece. So you have an employer that's checking on training, that's making sure that there's training done. Maybe something's missed. Maybe they end up on site and there's people on site that, I can drive that forklift. Like I get, and I get that attitude. Like I pretty well understand the controls of lots of machines. But if I'm not trained and I'm working on site and I say, yes, I can. Now whose responsibility is that going to be really too? And the supervision of workers is another checkpoint that needs to be crossed. So yes, we can rely on contractors for this information and to make sure that everyone's working safely and doing this stuff. But when it comes down to it, an employer has high responsibilities, and same with supervision. So we have, depending on how many layers of responsibility we have on any given work site, we have that many checkpoints, and that many checkpoints to make sure that a worker doesn't just jump in a piece of equipment and drive it because they know how, and then something happens. If something happens and we have an incident on site, they're going to be looking at those levels of responsibility, and any of them will be subject to being held accountable to those responsibilities. So I think that's something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Mike. That's really great info to add on to that. Just because someone has a different layer of responsibility does not alleviate you of your responsibility. Everybody maintains a responsibility and everybody can be held accountable. So that is really great. Okay, let's go on to, this is an interesting question. My mom is hiring someone to put shingles on the roof. Is she considered the prime or the contractor, and what are her responsibilities? Would anybody like to go into that? There is specific legislation, I believe.
I would love to touch on that.
Okay.
Here's in the OH&S regulations, or in the Act, sorry, there's actually a piece in here that speaks directly to that. And it's all about a person ought to know kind of thing. So this is going to be in the Act at 3-1-3 actually. And it says here, for the purposes of subclass 1G II, which I will just see if I can quickly get to here, about being a contractor, basically. A person, partnership, or group of persons is considered to be a contractor only if that person, partnership, or group of persons knows or ought reasonably to know the provisions of this part and the regulations made pursuant to this part respecting the work or the place of employment at the time of retaining the employer or self-employed person to perform the work at the place of employment. And this is kind of like a homeowner's clause, where if my grandmother, was the example, was the grandmother? So, Joanne, yeah. So if my grandmother hired a roofer to come onto the roof, does she know that there's safety in place? Does she know about the Act and regulations? Does she know about properly trained employees? And in that respect, this homeowner clause or this piece of legislation would kind of speak to that. Say, okay, well, my grandma doesn't know anything about this. She was an accountant or something like that. And so she doesn't know she hired a contractor to do, or an employer to do this work. Therefore, the onus is going to really fall on that employer. Or on the contractor. If she had a renovation done, there's multiple employers on site, the contractor, the responsibility is going to fall on that. My grandmother doesn't know anything about working safely in construction, so she's not going to be held to that. Now, if I hired as a safety professional working in the construction industry, if I hired a contractor to work on my roof and to come here, and I show up home from work and I notice people aren't wearing fall protection on my roof, I notice that people aren't wearing PPE or doing dangerous things or substandard conditions or acts happening on my site, then as soon as I'm notified of that, I'm going to have some responsibility. I can't just close my eyes to it because I know better. So, Curtis, do you have anything to add to that?
No, that pretty much sums it up. That's kind of how I would answer it. If you're trained in the knowledge of your regulations and acts, then you can be held accountable. Just to kind of sum that up.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was great information, and that was, the legislation I was talking about that it pertains to, and it's really good to know your responsibilities when it comes to that. And it is still due diligence to make sure you're hiring a company. You want to take a look at who you're hiring and making sure they're qualified, right? So usually you open the phone book and you're going to look into roofers and take a look and maybe ask for some feedback from family and friends. Okay. If you are the largest contractor on site, are you by default the prime?
No. That is up to the owner to delegate that position. So that prime contractor position can be, again, it has to be through contract. It can't be a mere handshake or a high five. But yes, that can be anybody on site that the owner puts in place that signs a contract, and that would be bound at that point. So you could have a multi-billion-dollar company working for a three-man not subcontractor, but a three-man crew company, and they could be delegating the work of them as well. So it doesn't have to be the biggest company on site that would be the prime.
I'll supplement on that too. There is a lot of projects that go on around Saskatchewan that have a prime contractor role that is their role. They got hired as a prime contractor. They're not responsible for production. There'll be an architect firm or an engineering firm or something like that a company or an owner, a purchaser of construction, has delegated general contractor for the whole project and prime. But a lot of times, sometimes what they'll do is they'll take this firm and they'll say, okay, well, is there someone else that you would like to have in charge of the prime? And then they work together. The general contractor in charge of the production and the prime contractor in charge of the safety will work together in conjunction for a successful outcome. It has nothing to do with size of companies, honestly. It has to do with that contract.
Thank you, Curtis and Mike, for answering that question. So I just want to point out a couple things here in the chat. We do have some resources and links. We did post our resources for COVID-19 in there, as well as we do have a prime contractor toolbox talk that is available. The link is in the chat. And we do have instructor-led online trainer contractor class I was talking about coming up July 6th, if you're interested in that. As well, I do have another one here. There is a link for you to download the occupational health and safety regulations. We did post that in there as well. So those are downloads you can make. I do want to go a little bit to the audit and programs department and ask a couple questions. One of them is I have a core audit coming up. So companies have been contacted about remote auditing, and they want to know if they need to have Microsoft Teams installed on their cell phone. So not just your laptop, but the cell phone. Could we get that address, please?
I'm going to put this over a little bit to Carrie after, but no, you don't have to have it actually installed on your cell phone or your laptop. The auditor will send you a link, and that link basically downloads an interface and will allow you to connect with the auditor. Carrie, if you want to talk about just a little bit about how it would work for, say, observations.
Yeah, well, we'll utilize the Teams, Microsoft Teams, to have open meetings and discussions throughout the audit, but generally speaking, opening and closing meeting. And with regards to site observations, we'll utilize the technology of the cell phone, whether it's having like a FaceTime video or a real-time video, and you'll be walking around the site holding your cell phone while we'll be in contact with you or the person designated to help us through the observation process. And we'll be engaging and asking questions and having you hold your phone so that we can view and assess the observational components, whether that's indoors and outdoors, wherever it happens to be, providing that, number one, the contractor or the owner of the property will allow the cell phone. So that's part of the process. And number two, just you have to make sure that if you're in a hazardous area, that the phone is rated for intrinsically safe things. So you don't want to jeopardize or cause another hazard potentially. So we want to cover those bases. And yeah, so that's about all I have to say for that for now.
Thank you. And of course, when it comes time to this, when you're doing your core audit observations, you'll be in contact with your auditor. We'll be discussing some of the key points specific to your site. Every company is a little bit different on how they're set up, so they're definitely going to be in contact with you to tailor that to the needs. Another question here. Will the SCSA continue to offer remote core auditing? Should I start storing my files digitally now for next year? Just looking ahead at what's coming up. Kelly, go ahead.
Yeah, these are unprecedented times. We've had to kind of shift and adjust how we're doing things quite quickly. So the remote auditing process is actually very, very new to us, and exciting for us as well at the same time. I can't say for sure that this is the way that things are going to be in the future, but what we really need is for companies that we have completed core audits on and C-core audits to complete their post-audit questionnaire that gets mailed to them after the audit, because we are really looking for feedback. We want to hear what our members out there are looking for in terms of audits, and that will be our guide as to how we go forward. So please, 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 I know it's just another piece of paper and everybody hates all the paper that is associated, and I'm sure I could hear people's eyes rolling right now when they see the post-audit questionnaire, but it is so very valuable to us because that's our way to be able to connect and engage and get some feedback from you.
Yeah, I'd like to just share a little bit too, because we went through a process at SCSA, and we went to a digital storage of the documentation for the program. And we have the 2 cities in which to deal with. So it was just a lot easier in the end for a couple people who have taken the Health and Safety Administrator course to manage and store our program documentation electronically. So it can be very helpful for companies, because it's, in my opinion, I've seen companies lose and misplace paperwork. So sometimes if you do an immediate photo or scan, then you have it stored electronically and you have it 2 methods. So, and in the future, if we do continue, it will help you by managing it to do it in stages as opposed to 100 or 1,000 documents all at one time.
Thank you. That is great information. Again, those of you who are going through this process, please do fill out that questionnaire. Give us that feedback, and they'll greatly assist the program services going forward. Have another. I'm unemployed right now. What would the cost of taking NCSO classes? So someone's looking to achieve their NCSO. And if I'm unemployed, is sponsorship, can you get sponsored even if you're not working for them? So this is more about cost and sponsorship. And Kelly, would you like to answer this one?
You bet. Yes. So I guess, sorry, the first one was, what is the cost? Is that correct, Joanne? Okay, yes. So the cost for the classes, it's a per class basis, and you can find all of that on our website. I think the more relevant question here is sponsorship. If you are not working and you can contact a company that you've had a good relationship with, that perhaps know you and are willing to sponsor you, all they would need to do is to write a letter to us saying that they are sponsoring you with your full name as someone going through the NCSO program. And once we get that, usually the companies in sponsorship, they say that the student is going to pay for their own classes. So just as long as that's indicated on there, so that we know that even though they're sponsoring you, you are responsible for paying your own classes. Yeah, so once you get that, then you will be eligible for the $50 per one-day class or $100 for the 2-day class rate, which is substantially less than the non-member rate. So I would encourage you, if you can do that, please, explore that option. And in terms of the overall cost, that's kind of a hard one to pin down. You can see I won't list all the classes that are required because they're all on our website, but you can go through and you can take a look and you can do the math. Some of them you may already have. Some of the classes that we require for electives, such as like first aid, that is not a cost that we can determine. So roughly start to finish, it's about $700. That was the last estimates that we had. And time-wise, there is no limit on when you have to achieve your NCSO. You can blast through it in 4 months, or you can take, 4 years if you want. So hope that answers your question.
Kelly, I just want to clarify with that price though, that's for a member company sponsored company. That's not for somebody that's not sponsored or a member company.
Absolutely, yes.
Just to clarify that.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Curtis. That would be a member company. So that would be somebody who's actually working in the construction industry with a B rate code.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you. I do have a couple questions here, looking specifically at some of the documentation, some clarification, differences between JHAs, FLRAs, or generic hazard assessments. Who would like to address that one? Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Sure. I love this question, mainly because I'm not a huge fan of acronyms. There is FLRAs, FLHAs, PSIs, HABs. There is acronyms out of the yin yang in safety. The whole, I think that what's very important here is to look at what are we trying to achieve. It's not about the name of the document. It's about you can call it toolbox talk, a tailgate meeting. You can call it, it's the same with this. The point is to assess hazards in the workplace. Now, if you have an acronym or a name for a document that is a specific function, focus more on the function, I would say. If it's a pre-job hazard assessment, because you're going to look at the whole scope of the job, just understand what you're actually trying to fulfill in that document so that you don't fill it out as something else, as a daily hazard assessment when you're actually looking at the scope of the project kind of thing. So there's a lot of different acronyms, a lot of different names that people like to use for hazard assessments. And potentially there's a lot of different philosophies out there on assessing hazards. So the main thing I would say is, the general word I would say, or the words would be hazard assessment. What we're doing is we're doing a hazard assessment when we're doing an FLHA or RA, unless you're looking at different pieces of the puzzle. So just understand, make sure there's good training in place in your company. And if you don't know as a worker, clarify with your supervisor, what is the function of this piece of paper with this acronym tied to it. That's the more important piece.
Thank you for clarifying that. Next question here. Let's take a look at, maybe ask our auditor, Carrie, when it comes to the core audit, what are you looking for if there's a prime contractor is actually required? Is there something specific when it comes to auditing?
There's nothing specific to prime contractor in our audit tool per se, but each element has components of what Curtis presented and everyone on the panel today has talked about. We're looking for compliance through the audit process and the elemental questions, as well as legislative and then specific site rules. So we're looking for compliance through all those things. And by default, that's many of the responsibilities that's outlined within the prime contractor. So you break down each section, you're looking for hazard assessments that Mike just talked about, documented, the various type. We're not concerned about the acronym, but the actual process. Does it identify and control the hazards? And does it verify that it was done in a timely fashion? With training records for subcontractors, we're still looking for relevant training and certification to verify that the people are competent in doing the tasks. So by virtue of the audit, we are looking for most things that are listed within the prime contractor.
Thank you, Carrie. If I can add on a little bit to that question, since we're talking about contractors, let's say we're dealing with subcontractors on the site. how should a company specifically address subcontractors and having that system set up, and what you're going to be looking for as an auditor as well?
Well, first and foremost, we're looking for their training records, their compliance. Have they been orientated to the site? Have they been orientated towards the company? And do they know and follow the specific rules? So are they involved in the process and the project meetings? So they should have toolbox discussions talking about the daily hazards that are at risk for them, so that they're in discussion of control recognition of hazards and the tasks. Are they communicating with the other personnel on the site, other contractors? So we're looking for that cross communication. So each section within the audit tool outlines responsibilities and paperwork, documentation, validation. So that's what we're looking for subcontractors as well. So they should be participating in hazard assessments, either with the contractor, or they should have their own hazard assessments that they submit to the contractor. With regards to toolbox talks, they can be involved specifically with the group of people on site relevant to the task and hazard, or they can have their own discussion and then communicate to the general contractor or the safety person who coordinates activities. Other than that, I think that's an overview of all things related to subcontractors. So just know that, treat them like employees and verify that they're following and conforming to site standards and regulations that the government outlines.
Thank you, Carrie. Also, when it comes to subcontractors, here I have regarding the program, does the SCSA have a checklist or orientation checklist, some way that the advisory services can assist a company setting up and preparing for subcontractors? How can we assist them?
Absolutely, we can assist them. We do have lots of forms and documentations and things like that we can provide to companies at no charge, of course, specifically to our member companies as well. So yes, if you guys need documentation or anything to help you with your safety program, please contact one of our safety advisors and we'd be glad to help you out.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go back to a question here. My supervisor is 70 years old, and has been in the trades for a long time. Does he require supervisor training?
If he is doing, if he's engaged in a supervisor position, if he is being deemed a supervisor on that construction site, if he does not have supervisor training, he would need to get that supervisor training before conducting that role, of course, to ensure that he understands his roles and his responsibilities and his legal responsibilities in regards to the regulations and how to fulfill that position properly. There is a snip of information in legislation that you can refer to. Mike, do you have that in front of you? Did you want to touch on that a little bit?
Sure do, Curtis. You're reading my mind. You're
Absolutely.
reading my playbook, man.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. Along with what Curtis is saying, in legislation, I know I've been referring to legislation lots, but I think that this is very pertinent to understand what the minimum requirements actually are. Training of workers, this is going to be Regulation 19, training of workers. And it says here, an employer shall ensure that no worker is permitted to perform work unless the worker has been trained and sufficient experience to perform the work safely in compliance with the Act and regulations. This is probably just, I think this is just one spot that you can find this. This is going to be the same as the equipment training and stuff like that. If a supervisor actually doesn't know, like maybe it's an electrician and the 70-year-old electrician, he's been in electrical trade his whole life, doing his own thing. He's his own one-man crew, right out of the gates. He kind of was doing his own thing. He gets hired by a company to now, he's been in the electrical trade forever. He understands the construction industry, all that, but potentially he was never trained as a supervisor. And what does that mean? He doesn't understand his roles and responsibilities. Potentially that 70-year-old gentleman has no idea how to read the Act and regulations. Now, when it comes to an employee coming up to that 70-year-old worker and saying, hey, I gotta work with a ladder in this situation, or I gotta do something here. I don't exactly understand what the law says on this. And you have a 7-year-old guy that understands all things about the trade, but doesn't necessarily understand the law, doesn't understand how to find out what the law says, and other pieces. So in supervisory training such as LSE that we provide, it's a 2-day training course, we provide training on these other aspects of actually how to be a supervisor, not on how to be an electrician, but on how to be a supervisor. And so, yeah, if that 7-year-old worker is going to be a supervisor for a 2-week project and has never had supervisory training, you need to train the worker on how to be a supervisor.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, supervisors do need to be are required to be trained in their responsibilities. That's the easiest way to say it. They do need to be trained.
Yeah.
Next here, I'm going to go into this question. I am a safety professional and have been for 8 years. I've been in the field for approximately 60% of the time. I do work 40 hours a week. The rest is going to be in the office. I do have an HSA, but I do want my NCSO. What kind of experience do I need for field experience to go in to be NCSO? What qualifies it?
So specifically, the kind of experience you're going to need is construction experience. This is a construction designation. So it has to be, this would be your journeyman, your boots on the ground people, your foreman, it could be your site superintendents, anybody who's out there working on an active job site. If you have not spent your entire time, say, working directly on the job, if you've got one of those jobs where you're half and half, say you're a site super and you're working in the office 20% of the time or 40% of the time, what you'll need to do is to take a look at your overall experience and map it out year by year, so to ensure that you actually have a cumulative 3 years of construction experience. It's important to note that what we do not accept for experience for the NCSO is safety experience. So if you are just a straight safety coordinator or a safety manager and are not actually engaged in actual site work, that will not qualify. That is for the HSA designation. There was something else I was just going to add in there and I've forgotten. But yeah, so the other thing that we do not accept is oil and gas. Oil and gas experience does not qualify for the NCSO program. If you're in doubt, you can send us an email. We can clarify exactly what you need. We have an email address set up for the NCSOs, and that's ncso@scsaonline.ca. One more time, ncso@scsaonline.ca, and we'll be able to answer all your questions about the NCSO program.
Kelly, I'd like to add on to that. There's something about a detail of being current, that site experience being somewhat current, hey?
That's
Would you like
true,
to
Mike.
elaborate?
Yeah, your site experience will have to be 3 years. It doesn't have to be all together at one time, as I mentioned earlier, but it does have to be gained within the last 10 years to make it valid. So you could have done 1 year 8 years ago, and then 2 years, say 3 years ago, and you would qualify. It just has to be within that last 10 years.
Thank you. That's really great information for those wanting to be NCSO. So at this time, I just want to wrap things up. I just want to check out the chat, get some of your links there. We have great links and resources. Contact us for more information, as well as I just want to talk a little about next week. We were just talking about NCSO and HSA, your health and safety administrator. And next week, we do have a special presentation, and it is who wants to be a safety professional? And this is going to be a game show style. It's going to be a face-off. We're going to have NCSO and HSA, and really great information coming out of this. We're going to have a little bit of fun. And again, as always, we are going to have a question and answer period as well, with different representation from the SCSA. So at this time, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Again, if you have any questions, please contact us. We will get back to you. We do have a lot of resources online, and we'll see you next week.